So in this room we look at what happens to the group in the 20s and 30s, and the immediate effect of the First World War lingers in the set of 3 theatrical compositions that we see on this wall. We have from right to left Walter Sickert's portrait of Cicely Hay, William Roberts at the Hippodrome, and on the far left David Bomberg Ghetto Theatre. To begin with the Walter Sickert. Interestingly again, Cicely Hay, who is depicted here, was another female member of the London group. She sat several times to Walter Sickert, and this particular composition, she was sitting by the fireside and her face is lit up theatrically from beneath. The work was promptly christened Portrait of a Snub-Nose with a Lady Attached by one waggish critic once it was seen at a London group show. Sickert also uses a wonderful narrow format to compress his composition, further increasing the theatricality. Sickert was of course the master of theatrical composition. He was well known for his studies of music halls, in which he made the audience very often, rather than what was on stage, the subject of his work. This was an inheritance that would be taken up by David Bomberg, whose work is seen here on the far left. Bomberg was taught by Sickert at evening classes early in his career, and here he too is depicting the audience at a theatre. The theatre concerned is the Ghetto Theatre, the Whitechapel Theatre, the Pavilion Theatre in Whitechapel, where classics were performed but in Yiddish. For David Bomberg, who had grown up in the East End, Whitechapel and the environs had always been a scene of great vitality and inspiration for him. However, this picture is much influenced by what happened to him during the First World War. Bomberg had fought in the trenches, he had lost his brother. Deeply traumatised by these losses, he had shot himself in the foot. Once he was patched up medically, however, he was returned to his unit where he worked as a runner, retrieving dead bodies. He was taken away from this to become an official war artist for the Canadian War Memorials Fund, and he was taken on to complete a composition of sappers at work, the tunnellers. However, after the rejection of his first futurist version of this composition, he was deeply demoralised, despite completing a second version which was more naturalistic and which was accepted. All of this disillusionment fed into the way that Bomberg depicted the theatre in this composition. We have the spectators on both rows who are separated both from the viewer and from each other by this sharp diagonal balcony rail, which very boldly bisects the composition. The figures themselves are very hunched and their faces are very mask-like. The colours are generally drab, and the figure over here on the far left, leaning on its stick, is symptomatic of Bomberg's state of mind at this time. He painted this composition on the eve of his departure from the East End, making a transition between the work he had made pre-war and the work which followed post-war. This work is also from Ben Uri's own collection, and we are very proud that it was bought directly from the artist in 1920. It forms a nice pairing with the William Roberts next to it. The two works have been hung together so that the diagonals of the balcony rails meet in the centre. Basically, it's the same composition, but reworked to reflect a slightly different theatre audience. Roberts' audience is at the Hippodrome, where an early silent cinema was being shown. And indeed, it's thought that some of the words from the cinema are being reflected back on the wall on the right-hand side. Roberts himself shows traces of the vorticist style lingering in this composition, though they would too disappear from his style shortly afterwards. This scene of great vitality is typical of Roberts' work. He did many crowded pictures with people at leisure, cycling, swimming, in the park, on the bus, and so on. But famously, he himself was a shy and curmudgeonly man, and the subject matter is somewhat at odds with his own personality.